So welcome back. This is segment 2 of our asynchronous class for today. And before we jump into the agency material, I wanted to talk for a second about writing, which we always do at the beginning of class. I don't have anything in particular to talk about from the Williams book, but instead I want to just talk quickly about a kind of checklist of things that I've developed over the past few semesters that I will circulate to you guys, but I wanted to quickly run through them and just mention what they are, and then I'll send these around by Canvas, and you can take a look at them on your own time, but I just want to mention each of them. These are, as I say, a list of, 15 or 20 items that I've kind of developed over the past few semesters that I think are good to keep in mind. Right? Some of them we've talked about many times, but this is a place where they're all collected into one easy reference sheet. So let me just quickly run through them, talk about them for a second, and then when we meet in class again in person, we can spend more time on them if you like. So here they are, right? A list of 15 or 20, just a checklist of things to always keep in mind when you're writing, particularly for your larger papers, but also for the smaller ones. So first, you want to make sure you have a clear thesis, right? That's not something that we need to spend more time on. You want to state it in the introduction and make sure you repeat it in different ways, rephrased throughout the paper so that nobody is confused about what your thesis is. Second, you want to remember that this is a research paper, right? This isn't just you discussing the topic from your own head. You want to make sure that you are reading appropriate research materials and then citing those materials. When you write the paper, you want to include, if you can, counter arguments and replies to those counter arguments. Now, again, sometimes that can be a section of your paper. It doesn't have to be. It can be, but even if you don't include it as a section of your paper, if there are key counter arguments against your claim, you probably want to discuss them. Fifth, when you write your paper, make sure that you are using citations properly, and we've discussed when you want to drop citations, and sometimes how you can maybe skip ahead a few sentences and have another footnote or another citation, but you want to keep in mind whether you're using cites properly. Sixth, you want to make sure that in the paper you're using effective signposting. When I say signposting, I mean just literally saying, in this section 1, I'm going to do such and such. At the end of section 1, you want to make sure that people know what you did in that section, and then when you get to the second section, you want to be clear that it's the second section of your paper, and there's nothing wrong with using that language explicitly and talking about part 1 or section 1 of your paper. Seventh, and this is not as easy as it sounds, you want to try to make sure you explain how each section of the paper fits into your overall structure, right? So more explanation is better than less explanation. To the extent that you can say, in section 2, I will do such and such, and then have another sentence or two that explains how it fits into your broader thesis, right? That's going to be very helpful. Eighth, you want to make sure that you divide the paper, as we discussed last time, into manageable sections and subsections. It's very hard to read 5-7 pages of text without any break into subsections. Ninth, when you outline the paper and then when you actually write the paper and you have different sections, section 1, section 2, section 2A, section 2B, section 2C, you always want to make sure you don't have an A without a B, you don't have a 1 without a 2, right? Because if you only have an A and then you have no B, and you're then going to go on to, say, Roman 2, then you would fold what's going to be A into that main part of the higher level section, right? So let's say you've got Roman 1 and then Roman 2A and then Roman 2B, and then Roman 2B has 1, 2, 3 sections. Then you get to Roman 2C, and you only have C1, and then you get to D. You would not include 1, right? You would just eliminate that, and you would include the material that was going to go under 1 under the higher section C. So no A without a B, no 1 without a 2. 10th, when you do divide your paper and you have different headings for the different parts of the paper, you want to make sure that your headings are consistent in terms of form. So what I mean by that is sometimes for a heading, somebody will pose a question, right? Or you might have a full statement, a full sentence that will be the title of the heading for that part of your paper. If you do that, then you want to be consistent, and all of your headings should be, say, questions, although I don't recommend that. If you use full sentences, full statements, full arguments, then you would want to do that for all of your sections. If by contrast you use just a couple of words, right, to clarify what the section is about, that's fine. But then each of your headings should be just a few words, right? You shouldn't have one heading that is a 3 or 4 word title, and then the next heading is a long sentence, which is a claim, right? That's inconsistent. 11th, we talked about this briefly last time. Make sure you include an introduction to your paper, which is substantive, and a short conclusion. 12th, and this is maybe one of the harder things to do in any paper, you want to try to include transitions between your sections. So if you have, say, 3 or 4 sections, at the end of Roman 1, you don't want to end it abruptly and then have Roman 2 and start that section. You want to have a couple of sentences that transition the reader from the end of section 1 into section 2. And you might want to say explicitly, in this section 1, I have, and talk about what you did in section 1, and then try to include a sentence which will lead into section 2. So you might say, I've summarized X, Y, and Z, but I have not yet explained, I don't know, A, B, and C, which is going to happen in subsection 2. And then you simply say, right, that's the task of subsection 2 or section 2 or whatever language you want to use, right? So the key is to not end the section abruptly and start the next. It's to have some sort of elegant transition between the end of one section and the beginning of another section. To some extent, you might even want to do that, say, within the paper, within lower level headings. So if you've got, Roman 1 is the introduction, Roman 2 starts your analysis, and you've got 3 sections under that, A, B, and C. You might also want to transition between your A and your B and your C. So you don't want to just end A abruptly and jump into B. Sometimes you can do that if the sections are very short, right? So again, no rules are written in stone, right? All suggestions. But you might even want to have sort of sub-transitions inside the paper. 13th, and this is something we mentioned, always watch the use of this or it at the beginning of a sentence. 14th, we talked about this also, avoid excessive use of quotes, right? Only use quotes when the original language is really essential to get across to your reader. 15th, avoid what some people like to call legalese or legalisms, right? And Latin phrases. Of course you can use the occasional Latin phrase. In fact, it's a nice thing to do. I'm not suggesting never to do it, but your paper doesn't want to be full of legalese and Latin phrases. It comes across as a bit formal and not really accessible to every reader. 16th, try to be consistent with plural and singular pronouns. Right? This is something we talked just briefly about, but if you talk about an entity, right, then you shouldn't use the pronoun they, because they is plural, whereas the entity is singular. So to the extent that you can, try to be consistent with plural and singular use of pronouns. 17th, as we've discussed, watch general use of grammar and punctuation. So be careful with your use of commas and semicolons and colons and apostrophes. There's times when people will use apostrophes even if there's not a possessive, and I don't know why, but they'll sort of be an errant apostrophe in a word. Or sometimes a student will use the possessive, but they will fail to include the apostrophe. Same with commas, right? Rethink when you want to use commas, understand the rules about the difference between commas and semicolons, and make sure you're watching your grammar and punctuation and using the right marks. 18th, and we're getting done. Only have about 3 or 4 more of these. So as we've discussed in class, you always want to cite to a source, not to a URL. It's certainly fine to include a URL, right, to supplement a site if you want to do that, but that shouldn't be the entire site, right? The URL should not be the entire site. You want to cite to the document and then include a URL if you'd like. 19th, when you write your papers, please double space and use 12-point font, 12-point font. 10-point font for footnotes, although I don't have a strong feeling about that. I tend to double space the body of the paper and then single space the footnotes. Although I actually space between the footnotes, but that's different, right? That's not the same as double spacing. So single space the paper, double space the paper, use single spacing in footnotes, but you want to double space or use 1.5 spaces or something like that between the footnotes. And then again, 12-point font for the paper, 10-point font for footnotes. 20th, use footnotes in Blue Book format, right? Don't use endnotes. There should not be endnotes at the end of the paper. They should be footnotes, and you should avoid citations in the text of the paper itself, right? So no reason to include a case name in the body of or a case citation. You could include a name if you were discussing the case, but not a citation in the body of the text. And then I guess one more, right? Although I like having a top 20, but I do have one more that is sort of maybe a given, so we won't really number it. Try to follow Williams' suggestions. I know that's a lot to ask, and I'm not repeating them all here. We've been talking about them all semester, but really do what you can to say to yourself, am I taking his advice seriously and trying to follow it throughout my paper? That's obviously very difficult to do. He's got a lot to say, although we're trying to narrow down some of those admonitions in class. So do what you can to follow Williams' suggestions. That's the end of this segment. When we pick up with the next segment, with segment 3, we'll talk about agency.